Estoy aquí al lado de mi colega co y co-organizador, Mari Buck. Le queremos dar la bienvenida a la doctora Eve Zyzik. ¿Estoy pronunciando bien su apellido?
Sí, perfecto.
Muchas gracias. Es un honor tenerla aquí de la Universidad de California en Santa Cruz. Adelante, Mari.
Yes, so thank you again, Professor, for being here with.
Oh, Marty, you're muted.
Mari, no te escuchamos.
Ah, no te escucharon.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so so we're very excited to have you here, and you can go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here on a Friday afternoon. Um, I'm really excited to be sharing this with you. And I want to thank, first of all, my co-author and my colleague, Amalia Llombard. So the a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today was developed with Amalia. So I want to just make sure that I acknowledge her right from the very beginning. I've divided this presentation basically into two parts. So I'm going to give a little bit of like a primer about vocabulary testing. And I think you'll see that that's actually really important before I get into the data. I know we love to work with data and we love to talk about data, but before we can really understand what the data is showing us, I want to talk about what we do with vocabulary and why we look at vocabulary in general. Okay, so in this first part of the talk, which is the introduction, I want to talk about the why, the how, and the what. So why do we want to look at vocabulary? Why do we want to study vocabulary in heritage speakers and other learner populations and other speaker populations in general? And then we have to get into the how. How do we test it? How do we know how much vocabulary a person knows, right? Or what vocabulary they know. And then in particular, and this is the focus of my talk, is I'm going to be talking about mid-frequency words. So what are those? And then again, why do they matter? Okay. And if at some point you can't hear me or it's not clear, please interrupt because I can't tell what's going on over there on the other side of the screen. So if something's not clear, let me know. So why vocabulary? There's a lot of text on this slide. I'm not going to read it, but just in very broad terms, we know that vocabulary is a predictor of general language proficiency. So just general overall ability in the language, right? And there's lots and lots of research that shows this in second language learners and also among Spanish English bilinguals. So the study that you have cited there, Naveau et al., 2025, really showed this very nicely. So vocabulary was the best predictor of global language proficiency, right? As they measured it with an adapted OPI. Vocabulary is also very strongly correlated or predictive of all of the skills, right? So listening comprehension, reading comprehension, writing ability, speaking ability. And again, lots of research from many different learner populations that shows that, right? And you may be most familiar with the research on reading comprehension because that's sort of where that line of research started. But since the original work on reading comprehension, it's been expanded to all the language skills. So there's other reasons why I think vocabulary is a really good target. And so I'm going to talk about each of these reasons a little bit in turn. Why vocabulary for heritage speakers? I think vocabulary is a particularly good target because a lot of vocabulary test formats, and I'll get into that in a minute, some of them don't require literacy at all. And others have relatively lower literacy demands than other kinds of tests that we might want to give them. So I think this is a very powerful benefit of vocabulary testing. It's also relatively easy to make a vocabulary test dialect neutral. It's a little bit harder to do this with a grammar-based test, right? So the test that I'll be talking about today is dialect neutral, and I'll explain what that means. And if I don't, please ask me in the question and answer session. I want to point out that when we have a grammar-based test or a closed test, we're also testing vocabulary as well. There's no way to really get around that. However, the opposite vocabulary test that just tests word knowledge and nothing else. So I'm going to show you an example of this on the next slide. This is from a study of a placement test that was developed by a good colleague of mine, Melissa Bowles, at the University of Illinois. And this is an example of a closed test item. You might be very familiar with this kind of test. And if you look at the sentence and in what the learner has to do here in order to fill the blank in correctly, I mean, they're testing a little bit of grammar, but really it's testing vocabulary as well, right? I mean, it's testing their ability to differentiate between different word meanings. Tocar and jugar both mean to play, but they have different semantic domains. So this is there's no way to escape the question of vocabulary in these kinds of tests. I'm going to give you more reasons why I think vocabulary is a good target for heritage speakers. Vocabulary is vast, right? So our lexicon consists of thousands of words. The lexicon of an average native speaker can have, 30,000 word families in English. It's actually hard to pinpoint how many words a person knows because it depends on how we count words. But in any case, the point is that it's vast. So there's so many words to test, which means that we can really test words that are super frequent, and we can test words that are really infrequent. And in fact, those really infrequent words are almost like nonce words, if you want to think of them that way, right? We can also test highly specialized words. So there's just so much there to choose from when we test vocabulary. And what that allows us to do is we can make a test as difficult as we want it. And we can avoid ceiling effects that way. And ceiling effects are a real problem in heritage language testing, right? So a lot of tests run into a ceiling effect. When I say ceiling effect, I mean that it's just too easy for a lot of participants. A lot of participants are scoring the maximum, right, on a test. So I want to show you one example from an elicited imitation test. I'm going to show it to you on the next slide here. I want to let you have a moment just to look at what this is showing. And I'll explain it. So this is a right map, and I'm going to be showing you some from my own research here in a little bit. But what I want you to see is that on the right side of the map are items on this elicited imitation test. So like item number 34 is at the top there, and it's the most difficult item. There's other items, they're all numbered 33, 36, and so on. And then on the left side of the map, you have people, and these people are also ranked on this Logit scale according to their ability. So the people at the very top are the highest performers, they're the most able people in the sample. And what you see is that there's a lot of people in their sample. They're labeled as HS or L2. There's a lot of people in their sample that have an ability level that far exceeds the difficulty level of the items. All those people above item 34 are at the ceiling. They're above the ceiling of what this test can do. So the test isn't capturing the ability level of these particular participants. It's not differentiating between them at all. That's what you see if you have a ceiling effect in your data. Okay, I'm moving on now to the next part. I'm still within the introduction. I want to talk to you now about vocabulary testing. How do we test vocabulary? There's a basic distinction between recognition and recall. Okay, and so I want to have that distinction clear, and then we'll move on into sort of the more granular level of how we can test it. So when you have a recognition test, you always have options that you're giving your participants, right? They are demonstrating some aspects of knowledge, of word knowledge, but they're selecting from a number of options. So typically it's a kind of a multiple choice type situation, or in picture tests, they can hear a word and then maybe select a picture from a number of options. But the key is that there's always options. Recall tests have them recall, as the name suggests, or they produce some aspect of word knowledge from a stimulus. So that maybe they have to produce the word itself, right? If I show you a picture of a squirrel and then you have to say squirrel, if you're being tested in English, or you have to say ardilla, that would be a recall test, right? There's other formats, but that's just one example. So then if we get into a more detailed classification, this one is one that you may be familiar with. We have on the one side, we have recognition formats. So we have meaning recognition, form recognition. We have meaning recall and form recall on the left. The particular kind of test that I'm going to be talking about is a meaning recognition format. And I'll show you an example of that so that it's very clear what I'm trying to do. No single test format is going to tell us everything that we want to know, right? So that's really important to keep in mind, because there's been lots of ink spilled on pages saying, well, this format is fine, but it doesn't tell us X, Y, or Z. Yes, it doesn't tell us that because it's not designed to tell us that. So it's never going to tell us everything that an individual knows about a particular word. They're all limited in some way. You may be familiar with yes/no tests, right? Where basically people are given a list of words and they have to decide, is this a word or not? That's a form recognition test. That's just asking them, do you recognize this form, and is it a part of the language? Right? It's not asking them for anything more, and it's not designed to. Okay, so here's the format that I'm going to be working with, and I'm going to be talking pretty much exclusively now about this meaning recognition format. So remember that in recognition formats, you're always given options, right? Here we have the target word. It's amparo, and then they're given 4 options, one of which is the correct answer. Now, sometimes these meaning recognition formats will actually embed the word in a sentence, in a very short sentence. So like amparo would be given in a short sentence, and these are called often non-defining contexts. So the sentence is so vague and so generic that it actually doesn't tell you what amparo means, but it does help you identify the part of speech. So we can talk a little bit about that and whether it's really needed for Spanish or not. Okay. And then another option that you can give people is you can give them an I don't know option, and that's something that we've done in our test, and I'll explain why. So as I mentioned earlier, no single format is going to tell you everything you want to know. Researchers are in agreement about the first point here on this slide, that recognition tests require a lower threshold of knowledge than recall tests. So another way to say this is that recall tests are generally harder. They require more knowledge about the word in order to recall it or to recall its meaning. There's been a lot of debate about the second point, and I don't want to get into this debate because it's linked to reading comprehension. So there's been many, many studies about this particular issue of which kind of test is a better predictor of reading comprehension. And some people say that it's meaning recall, and some people say, well, actually meaning recognition is just as good. So I just want you to know that that debate is out there. One thing I will say is that And it's pretty obvious if you've ever designed any test for your classes. If you're a teacher and you've designed any kind of a multiple choice test for your classes, it's pretty much inevitable that students can guess, right? So there is some possibility of random guessing. If you give them four options, they can guess the right one, even if they have no idea what the word means. So that would be random guessing, but there's actually lots of things that happen that are more interesting than random guessing. There's some ability to use test-taking strategies. There's some way to say, well, I'm not sure what the word means, but I know it's a negative word, so I think it's going to be this. There's all sorts of ways that they can get at the right answer if they don't really know the word well. And that sort of takes me back to the first point on this slide, which is that recognition tests are a lower threshold and they can actually capture some partial word knowledge that way. Okay, I can't really talk about vocabulary testing without talking about word frequency. And I'm going to go through this very quickly because I think it might be things that you know already about vocabulary, but it's worth repeating. What we know about word frequency, and this is in general, right? This is sort of a general principle that is not language specific. So this is true for Spanish, it's true for English, it's true for, I don't want to say all the languages, but it's true for a number of languages that have been studied, is that there's a pretty small number of words that are really, really frequent. They're extremely frequent, right? Those would be like the first 1,000 words. And if you take the most frequent 1,000 words in English, they're going to account for 77.9% of all words on a written page of any text, basically. It could be a newspaper, it could be a blog, it could be almost anything. And those same 1,000 words, those same 1,000 word families, frequent word families, are going to give you even more coverage of spoken text. So spoken texts are have a lesser um, lexical threshold. Okay, so excuse me from excuse me. Should have unplugged my Alexa before I started. So I can go back to word families. I know I haven't defined that, but the important point is that these 1,000 words are going to be extremely frequent. In general, researchers have proposed this classification of high frequency words. Those would be the first 1,000, the first 2,000, and the first 3,000. So from 0 to 3,000 would be words of high frequency. Remember that first 1,000 is even more frequent, so you could call them extremely high frequency words. And then there's going to be low frequency words, which are super, super abundant. So there could be 100,000 low frequency words. And they pose a really difficult problem in language teaching because they're they are of such low frequency that people are not going to run into them very often. So we generally tell people, well, you just have to cope with them when you come across them. But then there's this more interesting category, which is that middle category, which is what I've been studying for the last 5 years, which are the mid-frequency words. So those are words above 3,000 and going up to 9,000, right? I think that to really avoid that ceiling effect that we saw in the other slide of the map, to avoid a ceiling effect, we really need to target these words. We know, at least from the published research, Marta Fairclough did a study in 2011 with heritage speakers with high frequency words, and she found a ceiling effect in her data as well. So we began our research with this assumption that if we only stuck to those high frequency words, we were going to get a ceiling effect, and we really needed to probe further. So there's the interest in the mid-frequency words. Mid-frequency words are also really interesting from a theoretical point of view. And I don't know how much time I'm going to have to get into this. It may be something that we can come back to in the question and answer session. But there's a model of language proficiency that was developed by Jan Holstein. And actually, his work goes back to 2011, and then he has a 2015 book on this that I think is particularly insightful. And the most recent publication from 2024 is also very good, in which he further develops this model of language proficiency, which is a model of proficiency that applies to native speakers and non-native speakers. So it's all language users. And in this model, he distinguishes between something called BLC, or basic language cognition, which is basically control of the spoken language. And it's all the high frequency words that we use in everyday situations and the frequent grammatical constructions that we use to make sentences and understand sentences in everyday language. And then the counterpart to that is ELC, or extended language cognition, which is basically literacy, and it's everything that goes beyond BLC. Now, since this is a model, he's not going to pinpoint exactly where one ends and where one begins. And I think that's where the mid-frequency words are particularly insightful or important because, well, this is just an idea that I have right now, is that due to their very nature, they could be at the threshold between these two kinds of language knowledge. And at the same time, we could think about them as possibly tapping ELC, or at least some mid-frequency words are probably tapping ELC, or extended language cognition. And the way we would know that is if we have a lot of variation among native speakers. Because what Hallstein predicts is that in BLC, in basic language cognition, you're not going to have a lot of variation among native speakers. And in ELC is where you're going to have wide variation. And so that would be one way to show that mid-frequency words, or at least some of them, belong over there to ELC. But that's just an idea. I think that's why they're theoretically important as well. Here's some examples from Spanish. I don't know if everybody in the audience speaks Spanish, but I can translate some of these words. So if you look at the 4,000 word level, you'll probably think, oh, those are not hard words. Yeah, because they're still they're real close to that high frequency threshold, right? So you have words like broma, or joke, hundir, to sink, right? But then as you get up into the levels, you see that they start to get a little bit more specialized. You have a word like perjudicial at the 5K level, which means something that is damaging, right? So it could have lots of high frequency synonyms. You could get around your whole life without using perjudicial and be fine. And then you get into words like calumnia at the 7,000 word level. So calumnia being slander. 8,000 level, tregua is a truce, and so on. So we can come back to what these words might be tapping, but I think that at least some of these words are going to be tapping ELC. Okay, so what my colleague and I did was we set out, and this was a pandemic project, I want to tell you. So it's a lengthy study. We set out to design a test for mid-frequency vocabulary. So for those kinds of words that I showed you, and we're going to be calling it CAVA. I want to tell you a little bit about the test itself, and then I'll give you a link too. I can put a link in the chat at the end for the test itself, because you can clone it from Gorilla and use it if you like. So it's a monolingual test. It's all in Spanish. The words are in Spanish. The definitions are in Spanish, and the distractors are in Spanish. There is an I don't know option, and we really encourage people to use it. We really want to discourage that random guessing, right? So if you don't know the word, don't worry about it. Check the I don't know option at the bottom. We spent, excuse me, a lot of time eliminating cognates and discussing which words were cognates, because we wanted to make the test as challenging as possible. There was an immense amount of cognates that we eliminated. I can talk more about that if somebody's interested about how we did that. And so the words are sampled from the 5 bands that you see there, from 4K to 8K. And test development was really a very lengthy process. We started out with what was really just a frequency-based test. So we wanted to have adequate representation of each band. And what vocabulary researchers suggest is that you do at least 30 words per band in order to make it truly representative. So that's exactly what we did. We had 30 words in each of those 5 frequency bands, which gave us a 150 item test. Now, 150 item test is really long. Even though it's multiple choice, it's a long test. It takes at least 30 minutes, if not more, to complete. And there were many items that were just psychometrically redundant, right? We were able to trim the test by applying rash analysis, and I won't go too much into the different steps that we took, but basically what we did was we eliminated any items that were misfitting. We eliminated items that were redundant, and we ended up with this, what I think is a beautiful 82 item test, which still preserves the part of speech ratio that we have in Spanish, right? So that was an important consideration. Like we couldn't just eliminate a lot of the nouns, for example, because then we would really be making the test not reflective of Spanish. So I'm going to move on now into the second part of the study. We're going to dive a little bit into the data. I want to show you some of the data. I'm going to talk about the reliability of the test. Whenever you design a new test, it's important to test the test, right? What is it doing and is it reliable? And then I'm going to show you some data from the heritage speakers' parents, well, not their parents necessarily, but the parental generation, what we call a baseline group. The data collection that I'll show you with heritage speakers took place in different years, right? So in the first phase, we had 79 heritage speakers, and then in the second phase, a different group of participants, right? This is particularly important because we can look at the reliability that way. These two groups have very similar profiles, so the test should give us similar results in both groups. And in order to do that, we did something in rash analysis called common item linking, which basically is a correlation between the item difficulty in phase 1 and phase 2. And I'm going to show you on the next slide that the data is showing us, what the data is showing is that the same items that were easy for phase 1 were also easy for phase 2. So broma was one of the words that you saw earlier. Broma is actually the easiest word in our test, and it's easy for the first group of heritage speakers, and it was also easy for the second group, right? So that's just an example, but you can see this here a little bit better on this plot, where the item difficulty estimates are plotted against each other. And so any item number that's a little bit outside of that confidence band maybe is giving us slightly different difficulties in the two groups, but for the most part, pretty much all of the items are fitting in really nicely and really neatly in those confidence intervals. The correlation was 0.95. The disattenuated correlation is 0.98. So these are really strong reliability metrics. Another type of data that the rash analysis gives us is this. It gives us the reliabilities that you see there, which are equivalent to Cronbach's alpha. But it also gives us something called separation. This is really interesting. because what separation tells us are the number of different levels in a test. So these separation values, like person being 5.06, tells us that there's at least 5 different levels of ability in our group. This is for all of the participants combined. And it also tells us that for the items, there's at least 7 different item level difficulties. I'm going to show you now the right map. And I want you to think back of the right map that I showed you earlier in the talk with the ceiling effect. So our right map looks really different than that because we don't have a ceiling effect. We have a more of an even distribution. So let's take a look at it. Actually, this is the one. I'm going to show you another one, but in a second. What you want to know, what you want to see here is that the persons and the items that are lined up together, it tells you a little bit about their probability of getting that item correct. So if they're lined up together, that means they have a 50% chance of getting that item correct. If they're above that item, they have more than a 50% chance of getting it correct. And conversely, if they're below it, they have a less than 50% chance of getting it correct. So this is the data for all of our speakers, all of our heritage speakers, all 163 of them on the 82 item test. The words don't, it does something really weird with accents. So that's why the accents don't come out. But what you can see is like this really nice distribution of items and people. Like they're not all bunched up together and they're distributed throughout the difficulty range of the items. So the most difficult item is the one at the very top, and it's the word lúdico. And the easiest item is at the very bottom, and it's broma. And our person abilities also mirror the item difficulties. Okay, you have the mean there in the very middle at 0. Then you have 1 standard deviation above the mean, and t is 2 standard deviations above the mean. Okay, so I have just a few minutes, and I want to tell you about the data that we've been collecting and that we're still collecting with adult Spanish speakers who are living in the US. These are what we're calling the baseline group, right? So these are adults who came to the US after age 18. Now we have a couple of people in our sample that are cyclical migrants, so they might have come for the first time at 8 or 9 or 10 and then gone back to Mexico or their country of origin. They completed schooling in their country of origin. They're bilingual to some degree, although they do prefer to use Spanish in their daily life. We gave them a language survey, and then we asked them to take our test, our 82 item test. We have a little bit more, we have more data now, but I'm just going to be presenting the data from these 26 individuals. So you can see there that these are basically individuals that arrived around age 18, and that's when they stopped their formal schooling as well. And their mean age at time of testing is about 39, 40. Okay. I'll tell you that the 82 item test seems very long for them. And a lot of people started it. We had a lot more people that tried to do the test and then didn't finish it. So we had to throw their data out, unfortunately. We have a variety of professions that are represented by this group of our parental generation speakers. And we just ask them to write what they do for a living. If they're retired, we ask them to write retired. And these are some of the things that they wrote. So I'm just quoting from the background survey. And I will talk a little bit about this data in a minute, but these are the descriptive statistics. Now remember, this is an 82 item test, right? And the mean on this test is 73.38. It's really very high, especially when you compare it to the heritage speaker group, which I'll show you in a second. So you can see the difference between the two groups. This is the comparison between the 26 adult from the baseline group and the 163 heritage speaker group. You see a higher mean, which is statistically significant, but mostly you also see a much um, reduced range of variation there. CAVA is not a good test for the adult group. It's not a good test. We didn't run the rash analysis on this group because it would tell us to throw out all of the items that were answered correctly by everybody. Right, so there's a ceiling effect. 32 out of the 80 items were known by all of our adult participants. And when you look at the differences in how they're scoring on individual words, the more difficult the word is, the larger the gap is between the two groups. So I'm going to show you that with some examples. Remember broma, joke? That was our easiest word, right? That was the word that most of our heritage speakers also know. And so the difference there is going to be very small because both groups know this word. And you could say the same thing for other relatively easy words like casco, helmet, suspiro, breath, rogar, to beg, and so on. So when the word is relatively easy, then the difference between the groups is there, but it's minor. When you get into the more difficult words, you see that the gap just widens, right? So esquivar, to avoid, perjudicial, damaging, repleto, very full, asesorar, this is an interesting one. Asesorar is to give advice, and the gap there widens between the two groups. So I want to finish up and I want to leave some time for questions. So what we've been able to show, I think, with the data from the heritage speaker group is that CAVA is a very good test for them. It's a reliable test. There's very consistent results in two groups of heritage speakers that were tested at different points in time. The test has good psychometric properties, high person and item reliability indices, and the 82 item test can distinguish between 5 levels of personability and 7 levels of item difficulty. So it's really, I think, a very powerful test for heritage speakers. I think it's not a great test for the baseline group. As I mentioned, there was a ceiling effect there, and there were significant differences, at least with the small number of people that we have in that group. There were significant differences between the baseline group and the heritage speaker group. Limitations. Clearly, the small sample size of our adult group is a limitation, and we're gathering more data right now. Right now, nobody wants to fill out questionnaires, and with good reason. So we're having some trouble, but one by one, we get a few more people every day to do the test for us. If the results hold, if we had 100 people and the results didn't change very much, what they would show is that the mid-frequency words are generally very well known by this baseline group. And then we have to find an explanation for why the parental group knows these words and they know them well, and our heritage speakers don't. And I have some ideas, but maybe you do as well. And I want to finish up. This is my very last slide. This is sort of kind of lessons or takeaways from this very lengthy project that Amalia and I started. It began as a pandemic project. We had so much fun choosing the words. They were chosen randomly, of course, from the corpus, but then we had a lot of fun deciding what was a cognate and what was not a cognate, and which word was difficult to define, and which words to keep, and which words to throw away. So that in itself was a lengthy but very fun project. I don't recommend doing anything like this if you're um, an assistant professor and trying to get tenure. This was something that, just I had the time to do it and I wasn't in a hurry to finish it. By the way, this is going to be coming out in the Heritage Language Journal. Just got accepted. So you'll see it in print shortly. Yay. But it was a 5-year project. So if you're trying to get tenure, this is not the way that I would go. Um, the whole test validation process is a really lengthy process. It's not just a one-shot data collection. These tests were, first of all, piloted extensively. So when we had the original 100, even to get to the original 150 item test, we had to do many, many rounds of piloting, right? And we went into it thinking we would have this 150 item test, but then as we did more testing and as we read more about vocabulary testing, we found out that really we didn't need a test that was that long. So lengthy tests, not only are they problematic from the point of view of participant fatigue, they're also psychometrically redundant. Once you start submitting them to some psychometric analysis, you find out that you don't need all those items. And it was very hard to let go of some of the words, but we're like, okay, we don't need this word. We can let go of it because we've got 4 other words that are telling us the same thing. And I'm more and more convinced now that these shorter tests can have very strong psychometric properties. They can have high internal reliability indices. They can have very good retest reliability. Um, and they can be just as powerful as a lengthy test. So I think that's where vocabulary testing is moving to. And I can put this in the chat as well, so you can download the test and you can clone it for your own use if you like. And just a lot of people that were involved in the project. I want to thank my co-author again, Amalia Llombart, and Breno Silva, who helped us originally with the rash analysis, and now I know how to do it myself. So he was a huge help. And then, of course, everybody that took the time to do the test. And I'll stop there.
Muchas gracias. Sí, por favor, si nos puede, por favor, compartir la liga, sería maravilloso. ¿Y alguien tiene alguna pregunta? Adelante, doctora Shen.
Maybe I missed it. I might have. Did you say how you administered the test to the baseline group? Like, was it in
Yeah.
person or was it on Qualtrics or anything?
It's on Qualtrics.
On Qualtrics. Okay, yeah.
Some of the people we tested in person. So it was all friends of friends of friends of friends and personal contacts.
Yeah.
So with the people that I knew, I sat down with them and I opened my computer and I said, "Can you take this test? And I'll make you a coffee in the meantime," right?
Yeah.
So some people did it that way. Some people said, "Well, I'll send it to my cousin or I'll send it to so and so, and can you send me the link?" So it was on Qualtrics.
I was just
But
curious.
it was all personal contacts. And nobody wants to do tests right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you for such a clear talk. I should have started with that. And I saw most of it before, and it was just as
Yeah.
engaging this time. So I really enjoyed it. So thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Well, I added all of the background, which I don't know if that was helpful, but maybe for folks that are new to vocabulary testing, it might have been helpful.
I loved it. Yeah, that's great.
¿Alguien más tiene alguna pregunta? Adelante, María.
Hey, thank you so much for that presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have a question based on the I don't know option. Did you see that a lot of people were using that option? And also, how would you compare that to maybe a Likert scale option? I guess kind of like heritage speakers tend to evaluate themselves like in the middle, like on a maybe odd based Likert scale. And so with this case, would you maybe expect the same things of heritage speakers putting I don't know as an option, kind of just comparing the similarities to that? Like maybe they second guess themselves?
This is a really good question. So it's a super question. The I don't know option is really controversial in vocabulary testing. It's our best bet with multiple choice tests. I mean, because if you leave it out, if you leave, if you don't give them the I don't know option, then they're forced to choose something. And then they are, if they don't know the word, they are randomly guessing and they have a 25% chance of getting it right. So we don't want that. But on the other hand, we don't know why people mark I don't know. And that's why it's controversial, right? Because like I could give you the test and I could give Martin the test and you guys could mark I don't know for different reasons. So we don't really like you could not know the word at all and you could mark I don't know, or you could somewhat know the word but not be sure of yourself and then say I'm just going to go with I don't know. So that's why we're not super sure why people mark. We can't know why they mark it. They do use it. They do use the I don't know option. Um, and that's good. That's telling because we insist on it when we give them the instructions for the test. Like we also don't want them to feel bad if they don't know the word. Like if they come across the word lúdico, which hardly anybody knows, by the way. They come across a lúdico and they're like, I don't know what that is. And if they start to get stressed out about it, we don't want that. So just mark, I don't know, and keep going. We tell them that. We're very explicit about that. And so that they don't feel like there's something wrong or, they have to know all these words. They don't. Say some of these words are hard, and if you don't know them, that's fine. Mark, I don't know, and keep going. Now, I've done some other, like some follow-ups, and I've asked people why they use the I don't know. And they tell me in like post vocabulary test surveys that they're like, well, I think it was this, but I wasn't sure. So I marked I don't know. On the other hand, a lot of people guess anyway. We asked them, how often did you guess on this test, even though we told you not to guess? And like 25% of the time, they're still guessing. But hopefully they're not randomly guessing. It's it's a very tricky thing. But thank you, Maria, for that question because it's a smart, very, very smart question. And I don't know if we have a good solution for it. Other than to not give meaning recognition tests and to go with like a different format, like a recall. But then that has its own problems.
I have a follow-up question, if
Yeah.
that's just thinking
Yeah,
about
yeah.
it. How would you see maybe like a confidence scale? Also,
Mhm.
like maybe after the question, like how confident did you feel in your answer, or would that it's already 82 questions that would make it
Yeah, I really like that idea.
something you
I think
consider?
if we could get it down to like even half of that, if it could, and I'm happy to share the slides. There was a recent study that they took the vocabulary size test for English and they reduced that from 140 items to 42 items. And it was a very good test, that reliability was very high. So if we could get our test down to even half of what it is now, and then we could add that confidence scale, that would give us additional information. But I'm not sure what we could do with a Likert scale. What were you thinking?
Oh, no, I was just saying kind of like just comparing the point I was trying to get, how maybe the I don't know more heritage speakers could pick that, considering how on a Likert scale they tend to like maybe
Go in the middle.
double that. Yeah.
You mean on like a grammaticality test or an acceptability judgment test? If you give them a Likert scale, they might go in the middle. Yeah, it's a good point. Thank you.
¿Quién más tiene otra pregunta o comentario? Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Ah, doctora Shen,
Oh,
adelante, adelante. Todavía tenemos tiempo para preguntas, de hecho.
mhm.
Well,
Adelante.
just if no one else was gonna ask, you were gonna maybe talk a little bit about dialects, because
Oh,
it was
yeah.
interesting. I was wondering how many, I mean, you showed us the different countries, and obviously your current sample size is large enough to test for any dialect
Mhm.
effects at this point, but how do you know that there won't be any or?
Right. So we eliminated any words. When we were choosing the words originally, we were choosing them like every tenth word, right? So just random. You take you take 1,000 words. So like words 4,001 to 5,000, right? You take your 999 words and you put all of those in a spreadsheet, and then you just choose every 10th word. Was sort of how we did it so that we get a nice range throughout that band. And that gives you a lot of words. And then from there, you eliminate, is how we did it. So then you eliminate cognates, those went first. And once the cognates were eliminated, then we needed to make sure we had the right part of speech ratio, right? Which is roughly twice the number of nouns as adjectives. And then verbs are slightly less than the adjectives. So, but yeah, but definitely twice the number of nouns as adjectives. We had an extremely hard time getting enough adjectives. Most adjectives were cognate. So we were like, we got to get rid of this one. We got to get rid of this one. But then we don't have enough adjectives. What do we do? So the adjectives were a particular problem with the cognates. But then we do another round of deletions, which was we got rid of anything that was region specific. And you can look at that in the corpus to see. Like, actually one of the verbs I remember very well that we had come up for us was apetecer. And apetecer is used more in Spain than it is elsewhere. Just the corpus will tell you that. And so we got rid of apetecer. We also got rid of things. There were a couple medical terms that we got rid of. We thought they were highly specialized medical terms. And we got rid of a couple of religious things too. Like, I think we had the word obispo, which we thought, well, like if they don't have any familiarity with religion, it just seemed kind of unfair. So we got rid of obispo. Maybe we should have kept it. I don't know. But nouns were not the problem. There were lots and lots of nouns. The problem was getting enough adjectives in there that weren't cognate. But yes, we tried to eliminate anything that was region specific.
Well,
We did eliminate.
I
Yeah.
love your answer, having it be informed by the corpus, right? Like
Yeah.
it's too much of a skewed distribution from
It
one
was
region.
right. And
That's
it's
great.
not that the speaker from Mexico doesn't know apetecer. They might know, and they probably do know, but it's just not used as much. Yeah.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. ¿Alguien más tiene alguna pregunta o comentario? Estamos muy agradecidos con usted, doctora. Sí,
Gracias a ustedes.
muchísimas gracias.
Gracias por organizar esto. Thank you so much for organizing it and for inviting me. I hope it wasn't too long or too boring. Hi, Damian. So nice to see you.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Thanks for talking for our awesome series.
Thank you so much. I hope you guys have a nice, calm end to your semester and a
Y
happy
tal vez a la
holiday
próxima
season.
nos acompaña en persona. Esperamos que a la próxima pueda venir aquí al
Espero que
UTN.
sí. Ojalá sea así.
Sí, nos
Okay.
ponemos de acuerdo y muchas gracias a todos los que nos han apoyado y han participado. Sé que varias personas nos han dicho que han estado viendo las grabaciones, así que las vamos a seguir publicando. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Gracias David y Mariana que están saludando en el chat y los vemos en Spanish Series el próximo semestre, empezando en enero. Muchas gracias a todos.
Gracias.
Bye. Ciao.
Adiós, muchas gracias.
Adiós.